Okay, so we are Platform Wellbeing. We work with organisations and we provide strategies, training and talking therapies. I'll go into a little bit more of that at the end. I don't want to detract away from the actual purpose of today's webinar. Oh, did I do that? There we are. I'm doing it myself. So workplace wellbeing, talking therapies, education wellbeing and supervision. So I will go into this in a little bit more depth at the end. Okay. So as we know, ONS are a wonderful fountain of knowledge for us. So some of the data that they produced reveals that almost a third of UK businesses are struggling to recruit staff and furthermore retain staff. Now, again, some of the figures that are quite stark in that arena are that just 22% of autistic adults are in any kind of employment, and only 64% of employees still admit to having little or no understanding of neurodiverse conditions. So by the end of today, we've got 3 fantastic speakers with us, which will allow us to look at it from 3 different lenses. We'll be looking at it from the clinical psychology element of it, from an actual employee point of view, and then from an organisation that's looking and supporting the education side of things. So if I just introduce you to our panel, we've got Dr. Kiran Sidhu, who's a clinical psychologist for ourselves here at Platform Wellbeing. We've got Laurence Shanahan, who's a communications officer for Platform. And then we've got Sophie Mason, who is the founder, CEO of Thinkedi and a HR consultant. So if I can just start by passing over to Kiran to start the webinar, and then we'll catch up at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be exploring neurodiversity in the workplace. So who am I? I'm a number of things. I have multiple roles and personhood. I'm a mum, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a netballer and I'm a clinical psychologist. I've worked in a number of settings, including a neurodevelopmental team for children and young people, and I class myself as neurodivergent as I'm dyslexic, and I have grown up understanding difference from a young age. So in today's presentation, what I'll be going through is looking at what is neurodiversity, where does it come from? We'll be covering some common neuro differences, and then we'll be towards the latter part of the presentation, we'll be looking at some stories in the workplace around neurodiversity and how to create, what conditions do we need to create for an inclusive workplace. Okay, so what is neurodiversity? So most people are described as neurotypical, meaning that their brain functions and processes information in the way society expects. But what neurodiversity refers to is the different ways a person's brain processes and interprets information. So people who are neurodiverse often think about and see the world differently, but it's also really important to note that neurodiversity does not affect intelligence, and I think that can be a common myth that should be dispelled. Neurodiversity is on a spectrum and is used to describe numerous neurological differences, and we'll be looking at a few common types later in the presentation. It's estimated that around 1 in 7 people, so that's 15% in the UK, have some kind of neuro difference. That people that have some kind of neuro differences are more at risk of suffering common mental health difficulties such as anxiety or poor well-being, and this is often due to a lack of support and the stress of masking and acting neurotypically to fit into cultural norms and the environment around them. So where does neurodiversity come from? So there's lots of research that debates whether neurodiversity comes from genetics or environmental factors. However, there's no direct causal links between genetics and neurodiversity, or environmental factors and neurodiversity. But what research indicates is that there is a common correlation of both. So it's widely recognised that genetic and environmental factors and their interactions contribute to neurodivergent conditions. But neurodiversity is much more than just a medical category, which is often defined by the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the ICD-11, which is the International Classification of Diseases. So I would like to come away from that medical lens. And I think the key thing here is about bringing the person into this and recognizing there is a person behind the label. Neurodiversity is a community identity and celebration of difference. It's helpful to think of neurodiversity as an experience. Diversity should be celebrated, and we need to move away from seeing neurodiversity through a deficit-focused biomedical disorder lens. I think it's really important to be careful with diagnoses, as they can cause internal or social stigma, which can then lead on to limiting a person's sense of self, expectations others place on us, and it can impact our long-term health outcomes. So a diagnosis of autism or ADHD does not identify what's going on a biological, cognitive, or psychological level for people. It's better thought as a descriptor rather than an explanation, and it's not a scientific valid concept. It's a cultural one. This doesn't mean that neurodiversity does not exist. It just means that the classifications and the manuals that we use haven't got it right yet, and it's a bit of a reductionist approach. So in summary, here are some definitions of what we've been talking about. So neurodiversity, every human brain is unique and comes from a different set of behaviours and characteristics. So the way a person's brain develops will impact their mood, their emotions, how they learn, how they perform tasks, how they socialise, and other aspects of daily living. So neurodiversity is a broad term used to describe the many ways in which the human brain and nervous system can develop. Neurodivergent, it refers to people who do not fit in neurotypical ways and have different support needs, which are considered neurodivergent. They are often diagnosed with developmental conditions such as autism, dyslexia, or ADHD. Neurotypical refers to someone whose thoughts and feelings and needs and abilities align with typical ways of functioning, and environments such as schools and workplaces are designed to support neurotypical people. So support aids is about what adjustments can we make for neurodiverse people who need to access and function in neurotypical systems. And often we find that if we make these adjustments, it usually benefits a lot of people in the workplace who don't have a diagnosis too. Okay, so here's some common neurodivergent conditions. You may have heard of many of these types of neurodiversity, and there are a number of other examples as well of how brains process information differently. But for today's webinar, we're going to focus on some of the common types. So autism is characterized by differences in social communication, social interaction, and sensory processing. ADHD, which stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is characterized by difficulties in concentration, focusing, hyperactivity, and impulsiveness. Dyslexia's characteristics include difficulties in organisation, planning, reading, working memory, and predominantly the brain thinks in images. just a little note on dyslexia and ADHD. There's what we're learning from new research is that ADHD and dyslexia can be understood in the context of early exposure to stressful circumstances, and the brain has to adapt. The limbic system is adapting to that stress. So there's some new research around that kind of the psychosocial aspects of dyslexia and ADHD. So dyscalculia is a specific difficulty in understanding numbers. Epilepsy is a condition where there are sudden bursts of electrical activity in the brain causing seizures. Developmental language disorder is characterized by differences in communication, understanding, and using language. Fetal alcohol disorder is characterized by difficulty in attention, working memory, and speech and language differences. Intellectual disability is often characterized by differences in communication and social situations, understanding new information, memory, and processing information. And the last one there, Tourette's and tic disorders, is what Tourette's is around is it affects the body's brain and nervous system by causing tics, which are sudden movements or sounds that people make. So here are some common neurodivergent attributes. I think there's lots of discussions around neurodiversity. It's kind of all often centered around the challenges that neurodivergent people face on a day-to-day basis, but it's also important to pay equal attention to the strengths of being neurodivergent. And I think highlighting the strengths and advantages of neurodivergent brains is helpful to move away from a purely pathological understanding of neurodiversity. But this shouldn't come at the expense of understanding the challenges faced by people who are neurodivergent. And it's crucial to offer support in order to limit the challenges caused by having to operate in accommodating environments. So here are some strengths and challenges, but I think it's really important to say that often strengths and challenges go hand in hand. So some strengths are around information processing, attention to detail, thinking outside of the box, recognizing patterns, memory, problem solving, and creativity. Some of the challenges are around social communication and social interaction, impulsivity, mental health comorbidity, emotional regulation, sensory processing, executive functioning, so thinking about kind of task management, time management, and flexibility and inflexibility. So going back to what I was saying about how often strengths and challenges go hand in hand, for example, for someone who is neurodivergent, they might attend to detail as a strength and spend lots of time focusing on that task. But then as a challenge, then they might forget to eat or have a drink or forget to complete a task which was a higher priority that day. Okay, so we're going to move on to what stories are held about neurodiversity in the agencies and organisations you work within. I'd really welcome any comments in the chat. If you've got any stories that are held about neurodiversity in the place that you work in, please comment in the chat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to some unhelpful and helpful stories within the workplace. I think, unfortunately, neurodiversity is often misunderstood and stigmatized, leading to discrimination and exclusion in the workplace. So sometimes that leads to negative stories. So these have been captured by some of the people that I've worked with. So some negative stories may be around neurodivergent traits being considered as people being anxious, or there's a lack of ability or effort there. That autism and ADHD are childhood conditions. So what does that mean for people that are adults? Staff are worried about being judged and that it might have an impact on their career progression. That they didn't see neurodiversity as a disability, so didn't declare it at the recruitment phase. This comment really resonates with myself. Having dyslexia, I rarely declared it on kind of job applications or even my application for my PhD because I didn't see it as a disability. Assumptions made about ability without consulting with the individual, and neurodivergent staff having to repeatedly restate requirements when managerial staff forgot or didn't see meeting these requirements as necessary. I think that's a really key point there in terms of having to keep reminding managers about the reasonable adjustments, which can be really, really frustrating, and it can also feel like your manager's not kind of holding you in mind. So yeah, that can be really frustrating. Okay, so some of the positive stories from the workplace are around staff feeling that they have been heard and listened to, and that slight adjustments have been made, allowing staff to thrive, take initiative and succeed. Neurodiversity embraced rather than just being seen as an obstacle, and encouraging staff to offer fresh perspectives. Adjustments to communication styles made to accommodate neurodivergent colleagues end up benefiting the whole organisation, which is a key advantage really, and what we see in a lot of kind of workplaces who are trying to be inclusive, that, you know, when these adjustments are made within the workplace, that it actually benefits lots of people, neurotypical people included. Okay, so we're going to move on to creating an inclusive workplace. So creating an inclusive workplace is about building awareness and compassion amongst teams, and it's important to use a relational approach to understand differences and to nurture the idea that we all think differently, we all learn differently, and we all feel differently, and it's that difference that is the foundation for creativity and originality, which brings value to the workplace. And most workplaces have been designed under the notion that if it suits the average person, it will suit most people. But having this perspective isolates people and denies access to those who don't function in this specific way. So instead, we should be advocating and focusing on creating inclusive environments, learning from each other by being curious and welcoming people to function in their most authentic self. And that can be achieved by speaking to colleagues that are neurodivergent, thinking about reasonable adjustments and accommodations, and also thinking that reasonable adjustments shouldn't just be a tick box exercise or tokenistic. We should focus on embracing difference and encouraging those diverse perspectives, so that we are focusing on fostering inclusion and more of innovation in teams and in the workplace. Okay, so thank you for listening. Next, we have Laurence, who will be sharing his lived experience of neurodiversity at work.
Thank you, Kiran. Can you see my screen there? Is that showing okay for everyone? Brilliant, thank you. So, hi, I'm Laurence. I'm a communications officer for Platform. I am also currently, unfortunately, the owner of a post-COVID nose, so if I do sound like I've stuck my head in a bowl of porridge at any point, do bear with me. So today's webinar, that's obviously about neurodiversity as a whole. I'll be talking to you mainly about autism, as that's where my experiences lie, but hopefully some of this will have slightly wider applicability as well. So it kind of feels like the million-dollar question with this stuff, right? Is what's it like being an autistic person? And if I or any autistic person could give a straightforward answer to that question, if there was a straightforward answer to give, then a lot of this would feel a lot easier to answer. But I've never not been autistic, so I don't have anything to compare it to. And importantly, I've only ever been one autistic person. And one person can't speak for the wide range of stories and experiences, highs and lows of a very wide group of individuals. There isn't one autistic experience precisely because we are all individuals. But I can tell you what it's like to feel valued and understood as that one autistic person. And I can also tell you what it's like to feel apart and alone as if you're not quite a full or proper person, and to feel burnt out. So I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome when I was quite a young child. These days, the diagnosis would simply be autistic spectrum disorder, but it's considered to be towards the milder end of the world of neurodiversity. This means that over the years, I became very good at masking, the process of pretending you're not autistic, of meeting every expectation, of never causing a problem, essentially of cutting off your toes to fit into someone else's shoes. In the workplace, this kind of becomes like trying to do two jobs simultaneously. You don't explain that the constant radio noise makes you feel like your skin is being grated. You don't ask for further explanations of your role, the expectations, who does what, where people overlap, the social structure. You instead absorb the impact of the anxiety and the uncertainty, and you assume that you are the problem. You don't explain that when you get home, your brain is churning images and faces and noises from your day like a broken television. And by the time you enter the workplace for the first time, you have already learned that difference can mean separation, assumption, that you'll only ever be nearly as good as everyone else. Like a broken tool that can still just about get the job done, but given the choice, probably isn't worth picking. This is, of course, not remotely true, and people don't need to be made to feel like this. Autistic employees are intelligent, hardworking, and capable as anyone else. They just operate slightly differently and therefore may even be able to offer different perspectives. You can't run software designed for Microsoft Windows on a Mac, but that doesn't mean that your Mac is broken. It just means that you haven't learned how it works yet. There is some good news to all of this, though. The changes and ideas that you can introduce to your workplace and your processes to help make them a better environment for autistic employees are also the same things that will help anxious people or stressed people or even people that are just a bit new. Like at some point, these changes are likely to apply to the benefit of every member of your organization at different points in time. So what are some of the key things that I've come across that may help you create that welcoming environment? Point one, ditch the assumptions. This is the big one. All autistic people, all neurodivergent people are different and have different ways of managing their challenges and making use of their abilities. So talk to your autistic employees as individuals. Don't assume that because something is difficult for them, that means they can't do it. And don't assume that just because you know something is commonly a challenge for autistic people, it will automatically apply to this or any other individual. Give your autistic employees the same opportunities as everyone else. And if there's something coming up that you know that they may find difficult, have the conversation, ask the question, talk about it. And when you do, listen to the response. Respect the boundaries that autistic employees set and understand that these may be different from person to person, as they are with everyone. And then embrace those differences. Many of the challenges that autistic people face come from the assumption that everyone needs the same things or everyone operates in the same way. But that's as untrue for autistic people as it is for neurotypical people. A workplace that ditches all the one-size-fits-all assumptions will help everyone. I'm going to look at a couple of personal examples. I have had managers, armed with having skimmed a Wikipedia article or two about autism, assume that I would struggle to connect with other employees and that perhaps my role should be limited accordingly, or that maybe I was best kept out of the way, given just the nerdy and technical things to do that don't really require talking to people too much. Because that's what all autistic people like doing, right? In the same way that all tall people just love tennis. Sometimes a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. I've met managers that have assumed that I should be spoken to or treated differently from neurotypical colleagues. And others, I think Kiran alluded to this earlier, have assumed that the boundaries and requirements that we did discuss were just whims of mine that could be overstepped when they really wanted to. I have also had managers, good managers, that have ditched the assumptions and the labels and come to me as an individual and with a willingness to understand that individual and to talk frankly and honestly about what the employer needs from me and vice versa. To respect requests for open and honest communication. And when something was coming up that they knew that I may find difficult, they didn't make the assumption and withhold the opportunity silently, but instead there was a discussion, there was listening, and I was trusted to be honest. Now, which of those managers, which of those management styles do you think got a burnt out employee who believe themselves to be intrinsically lesser than those around them? And which do you think got a hard-working team member ready to bring new ideas, resourcefulness, willingness to go the extra mile? And when it comes to the bottom line, which of those managers do you think was getting a better return on investment for their organization's staff budget? Often the best managers for autistic people aren't necessarily the ones that are experts in autism, or the ones that don't assume that they know everything, but that are instead interested in learning about people, about individuals. Curiosity is the key thing here. Don't hire autistic people because you think it's the right thing to do. Don't hire autistic people because you expect something specific from them that you're not expecting from neurotypical staff. Hire an autistic person because you have found them as the right person for that job. Welcome them in. Value them as an individual as you would anyone else. Be curious about what they need and how you can see them thrive and get the best that they can offer. Create an organization that is curious about people, that wants to learn, because I promise you it will help each and every person that walks through your door. So there's 3 key points I want to leave you with here to help guide perhaps some of your future thinking on this. If you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. It's a fantastic phrase that I actually first heard from a colleague at Platform Wellbeing. The difficulty with being autistic is often not the autism itself, but how the world reacts to and treats it. The world is not divided into neurodivergent people and neurotypical people. It is simply made up of people, and it's up to each of us whether we're interested in learning more about the people around us or not. Hopefully that's been a helpful look at how some of this process can feel from the employee end of the scale, so to speak. So we're now going to hand over to Sophie Mason, the CEO of Thinkedi, for a look into workplace inclusion. Just as soon as I can remember how to stop sharing my screen. There it is, Sophie.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to bring up my slides for you. I hope you're all doing well today. Okay, one moment. And the fun of Teams. Let me just show this. Fantastic. Can everybody see that? Brilliant. Okay, so thank you very much to Kiran and Laurence. Quite difficult to follow such amazing information there. But just to introduce myself, I am Sophie, and as Laurence said, I have started an organisation called Thinkedi to tackle this issue actually and diversity as a whole. So today I'm going to be discussing how we can be more inclusive in the workplace. My background is as a project manager and change manager throughout the third sector and then into the NHS. And I'm neurodivergent too. I'm autistic, and I didn't know I was autistic until about 2 years ago. So I think we're finding that a lot of females are finding out later in their lives due to the diagnostic model being quite masculine in how those symptoms or the presentation was kind of documented originally, but that is beginning to change. I found out because 2 of my children are also autistic, dyspraxic and dyslexic. So a nice diversity of neurodiversities there. And I remember asking the doctor, you know, why is that different? Because that's exactly how I think too. And I think, you know, many people are finding out this way too. So as Laurence said, you know, I've never not been autistic. So because of that, I've developed lots of coping skills, and quite often, you know, I will tell people I'm autistic and they will say something like, but you don't look autistic. And you know,
sorry,
yeah.
can I interrupt you? We can't see your slides. I don't know whether some can and some can't.
Oh, interesting. Okay, one moment.
Sorry, Sophie.
That's okay. Thanks for letting me know there. How is that?
Perfect. Thank you, Sophie.
Fantastic. Okay. So just to absolutely prove what Laurence said earlier, that some people may think that just because I've been distracted by this wonderful change with technology, believe it or not, as an autistic person, I can absolutely jump back in and be totally agile and flexible with this. Because as I was saying, you know, I've learned a lot of skills throughout my career and through the experience I've been, you know, I've experienced, because I've never not been autistic. And as Kiran said as well, I didn't see it as a disability. I didn't recognize that I was disabled. And I think a lot of that comes from, there is quite a lot of trauma that can be experienced as a neurodiverse person when you're asking for help, when people haven't maybe recognized that earlier on in your life, in schooling, for example, or even if they have been aware of that and that there's been a recognized difference. So that trauma in sort of asking for help has meant that now, recognizing myself as having a disability, it's very difficult for me to ask for that help. And Kiran also mentioned about reminding managers, about constantly having to remind managers. And so for the last decade, I have fallen into every single gap possible with interim managers or changes of managers, changing organizations. And so asking for those reasonable adjustments and seeing that experience and living that experience, I've seen all the difficulties. But then on the other hand, I've also been a line manager and worked for different organizations and seen the difficulties in the processes and how inefficient it can be. And then as a line manager, managing someone else's inclusion to make sure we're holistically supporting them to be their best, as Laurence was talking about. But doing that with my own neurodiversity, that's another barrier and step that we need to consider. So this is why I set up Thinkedi, which is an app that's always going to be free to users, and it allows you to set up a profile where you can share your reasonable adjustments. Go check that out for yourself. I'm not here to talk about that today. I'm here to talk about the workplace. Fab. So this is typically the kind of steps that people think about when they think about how to be inclusive in the workplace. We think about from interviews to job offer to onboarding, and then we think about the day-to-day. I want to talk about today the fact that there's a lot more steps to this process that we need to be considering this neuro inclusion in. So right from the beginning, we need to know the data of the diversity data of our organization, which can be really difficult if we have equality monitoring forms. So, you know, those forms that you might fill out maybe when you start working for an organization that might say, you know, what nationality, what language do you speak, sexual orientation, gender, those kind of questions. They may also ask in there about disabilities and neurodiversities. Which I think is a key point, actually, to ensure that you're mentioning neurodiversities such as dyslexia as well as disabilities, just in case people don't recognise that their neurodiversity might be legally under the Equality Act classed as a disability, and they might be entitled to that support. But those equality monitoring forms often end up in an inbox somewhere, or worse, in a filing cabinet somewhere, which means it's really hard to extract that information. So first of all, we need to know the actual key data of the people in our organisation so that we can strategize and know how to support them, because there's no point sort of proactively trying to seek out groups from people from a underrepresented group in the organisation if you haven't found a way to support those people through the process, or you will bring them in and you will traumatise them, and that's not going to be good for you or for them. So really make sure, first step, get that employee engagement, speak to your employees, find out what they need and enhance that. Next, we have strategy, which I've just sort of discussed. So we need to build a strategy that's inclusive to neurodiverse candidates. So, and that strategy doesn't have to be a long 20-page document. You know, it can be shared in an infographic, as Kiran was saying. You know, some people are more visual in that sense and have that more sort of visual memory. So this can be supportive, and also to have like bite-sized visuals. If you do have a long document, then it's breaking it up with those visuals if possible. And also ensure that these documents are going out in a format that is able to be read by text-to-speech software. So a lot of PDF files aren't, whereas Word format or Google Docs, most other formats do, but just check that before they go out. That would be one recommendation. Also, some of the tools that a lot of people with dyslexia might use, things like Grammarly, they're based in organizations over in the US. So check information governance policies to see whether, for example, the NHS for a while weren't allowing anybody to use Grammarly, and that was because of information governance going abroad, but we were able to adapt and change that policy so that people could use Grammarly. So just make sure there's no barrier to do with information governance that might be stopping people from being able to use these really useful tools. Next, we have organizational design. So consider how your workplace is set up. You might have people working in an office, you might have people working in, you know, a manufacturing plant, there might be people working from home, hybrid. So working from home can be quite useful for people sometimes with neurodiversities. Again, every neurodiverse individual is different. But for a neurodiverse person to be able to manage their own sensory environment, it can be useful, but also there may potentially be lots of equipment that they're using to support their work, and it might be easier to have that set up at home. I would make sure, though, that if people are working from home, particularly if they're working from home and neurodiverse as well, that you make sure that there's regular checkups to see how they're doing, because it can be very isolating. And also that any meetings that are attended, we don't just completely forget about those needs, because we have to consider all the different working place environments that people might need to use. Then we have job design. So this kind of goes into organizational design in, you know, do you need to be working for an office? If your team members and your staff, your employees don't need to work from an office, why? Why do they, you know, do they have to? Just consider that. And then also consider flexibility in the job role. So it may be that there's one particular job that has been done one way for a very long time, for example, that might be using a lot of paper and doing a lot of paperwork. And that might be a barrier to people who maybe need to use software to support them into their work environments, and support them in their daily tasks and to thrive and do really good work. So can they use computers instead of using paper? Try to be flexible yourself as an organization and as line managers. And also, people are very innovative when it comes to adapting their roles. So create an environment where people feel safe to ask you for what they need. That is the key thing that I can say today, because people will ask you for what they need, and it can lead to some really creative job design, and things that you may not have considered. So next we have the job description. So before you advertise a vacancy, consider how that role should be described, how it should be positioned, and how it should be advertised. One of my bugbears is people asking for great communication skills in a job description. And this is because as a neurodiverse person previously, I would see that and I would think, well, I don't have great communication skills, so I won't apply for that job. And that's because to me, communication skills meant having conversations on the phone. Now, I discovered about a decade ago that I really love using computers and being able to see people's faces, because I rely a lot on being able to read people's facial features to understand the context of what they are saying. Otherwise, I can take it very literally. So phone calls and having those phone conversations, I find quite difficult. So I would class myself as not having great communication skills. And yet I'm here able to speak at this webinar today. So make sure that you are being really clear about what exactly you need. If you need someone to deliver webinars, tell them that. If you need somebody to speak on the phone, tell them that. Or if they need to write lengthy documents, tell them that too. Make sure job descriptions are in bullet point form if possible. And if you don't need a specific qualification for the job, then try to focus on skills rather than qualifications. So next we have the job advert. So when you put it out, make sure that you are putting it into places where it will be seen by diverse groups of people. If you're asking for a CV, you should be aware that there can be unconscious bias when reading CVs with particular information that people might be looking for. And if you're using an application form, it's really key to make sure that you can copy and paste that information into a form, or you might be cutting down your talent pool by discluding neurodiverse people. So yeah, and make sure the format fits, because the amount of time, I'm sure everybody's been in this boat, but when you get sent out a job application form and you spend about an hour just trying to reformat everything. So make it as easy as possible, and it will mean that you're more likely to receive diverse groups of candidates, which means you're more likely to get the person for the role that is perfect for it. Make sure you're removing any jargon, and try to stick to quite literal language if you can, refrain from metaphors and simile that can be confusing. When it comes to the applicant sift, just one key point here, which is make sure that whoever's doing the applicant sift is trained in unconscious bias, so that they can call themselves out and the rest of the panel out on anything that they might be doing that's biased. With regards to the pre-interview, so a lot of people don't think about pre-interview stage, but actually it's really important to people, for everybody really with anxiety, but particularly in the neurodiverse community. So introducing yourself to the candidates, you can even send pictures out of who's going to be on the panel, and even some anecdotal information about them just to humanize them, because it can be quite daunting to go into a room of people you've never met before, or to even see them on the screen for the very first time. And just having some information, especially visually, can be really useful. Questions in advance for candidates can also be really useful. It's a great reasonable adjustment for people on the autistic spectrum. But also for everybody, if we just get into the habit of providing those questions in advance for everybody, then that's going to stop creating that barrier. Trying to make questions as literal as possible as well. So just avoiding that metaphor and any simile, just to make sure that we're giving neurodiverse candidates the opportunity to answer the question we actually want the response to. Okay, then on to the interview. I would say just before the interview, have someone potentially who's not on the panel, if the panel are busy, just check in with that individual and make sure that they're ready for the interview, because those 15 minutes before an interview, it's daunting for anybody, but particularly people with neurodiversities. And again, that friendly face can make such a big difference. When it comes to the job offer, make sure you've asked the individuals how they'd like to be informed. Some people might like a phone call, some people might not prefer a phone call or email. Remember, we don't want to exclude them from accepting the role just because of how we would prefer to contact somebody. And ensure that we give feedback if someone didn't get the role, because I think this is really key in the neurodiverse community. We are constantly learning. It's key in all communities, really. We need to keep learning to understand how we can improve. At this point as well, with the job offer, we often send out occupational health forms. And I think it's really key here to only ask for the information that we genuinely need. I've seen many occupational health forms that include what date did you have your jabs as a child, and if it's important to know that, then okay, but if it's not, you're creating a lot of admin for any individual. But if for someone with neurodiversity or disabilities, there is already an admin tax on life, so to add this to it as well is just another barrier. Okay, moving on to onboarding. So if we can make sure that we give really clear steps of what's going to happen, if there's a DBS check, for example, we could be saying that's going to take about 5 weeks. I will let you know in 2 weeks whether we've had a response, and then I'll let you know in another 2 weeks whether we've had a response. Just making it clear can help with that anxiety. So, and having those regular check-ins as well, especially if it's a particularly long onboarding process or if there are long waits to start the role. In day-to-day work, there's so much we could talk about, but I'm going to try and keep it swift. Presentations is one really key thing. So sans serif fonts, so fonts that have that kind of swirly writing or little twirls and things on them, they're serif fonts, sans serif being without those little twirls. Sans serif is the best because it's easier to read for those with dyslexia. And also having a slightly coloured background, so not having a completely white background, makes a big difference to the reading. If we can bullet point things, that really helps as well. Left aligning text, and as I said earlier, using infographics where we can. Another really key thing in the day-to-day is if we can have breaks. So I advocate for breaks every 45 minutes. This doesn't just help people from the neurodiverse communities, it also helps people who are introverted or who are more reflectors, gives them that time to think. It gives the colleagues time to collaborate and speak to each other and come back into the meeting even more focused and ready. But particularly for the neurodiverse community, that break every 45 minutes could make a really big difference to their ability to be present and in the room. For example, ADHD, it would be great to be able to have that break to move around, and the same with autism actually. And also allowing people to fidget, to stand, to move around if they need to. And for day-to-day working, sit-to-stand desks can also be really useful for this. With management, it's about making sure we've got regular check-ins, making sure that we are approachable, and keep redesigning the job. Develop the job around the individual to work around their skills, and consider taking aspects of the job from someone else's role and swapping that to basically delegate the best jobs to the people with the best skills. Learning and development as you go through your career, so making sure that that's inclusive in all the ways that we've spoken about, but potentially putting on extra training for people with neurodiversities as well to ensure that they're supported in the workplace, they know where to seek help, seek advice. And I think along with this is also creating a neurodiversity network in the workplace if you can. Talent management and succession management. So ensure your talent management isn't excluding neurodiverse groups. Quite often in the past, the people who were considered for promotion were chosen by other people higher up, and it's been shown that they would most likely, with unconscious bias, pick people who look and seem like them. So therefore, it's been difficult for people with neurodiversities to get into those prominent positions where actually they can support and influence all of the rest of the workforce with neurodiversity. So it's just making sure that there are those options in talent management and succession management for people with neurodiversities. And finally, we're getting there, thank you for listening, is making sure that we get feedback when people leave the organisation on their whole journey, and make sure that that is logged in a way where we can identify that learning. So that's it from me, and thank you very much for listening. I shall pass you back to Mary.
So actually, thank you, Sophie. It's actually passing back to myself, Helen Jones. I'm the marketing manager. Just we are running quite a little bit short on time, so we'll try and squeeze in a couple of questions if possible. But firstly, just to say thank you all, Sophie, Kiran and Laurence, for sharing that really insightful presentations about neurodiversity, particularly Laurence as well. I think to share that personal experiences is really powerful, and hopefully has helped a lot of people relate to that. Having a look in the chat, I haven't seen any specific questions per se, but a little bit further earlier on in the presentation, a lot of people were saying that when they actually went to their employees and said that they were, identified as neurodiverse, and that they were told often, oh, you don't look it, or you don't act like it. How, Sophie, this is a question I suppose for yourself. Is that an education piece from an employee point of view? How when faced with that kind of response, where do they go with that, basically?
Yeah, I think it's important to speak to your line manager or anybody in the workplace. Let's not forget that we're all leaders. Leadership comes from all directions. But to ask, and that's when I would start asking questions about neurodiversity networks and trying to seek out anybody else who's got the same experience, because it is always easier to sort of tackle these things as a group. But actually, a lot of organizations, they really do want this feedback. So it's that unconscious bias as well, so maybe suggesting that the organization has training in unconscious bias around things like autism to have an understanding, because as Laurence said, it's not something we can, we're going to eradicate in a day, because every single person on the spectrum with neurodiversity is very different.
Sure. And Laurence, coming to you, just what do you think that if you could wish there was just one thing as an autistic person that you would have known before entering the workplace, what would you think that one thing that you'd wish you'd known beforehand going in?
I think that kind of knowing pre-warned that although it shouldn't be the case, you may have to, I think as Sophie alluded to, keep requesting the changes that you need, keep requesting those adjustments, but also just bearing in mind that the process of requesting those adjustments isn't you causing a problem or becoming a problem. It is you essentially attempting to benefit an organization by saying to them, here are some simple things that you can do to make sure that your investment in me as an employee is returned by me as fully as I can. There's often, I think, an almost overwhelming sense of guilt or fear about asking for those adjustments, because your neurotypical colleagues aren't asking for them, right? So why are you being a problem? And that carries with it a tremendous weight. Sometimes it can be really difficult. In my first role, I don't think I disclosed that I was autistic until it became absolutely necessary to do so, because there was that fear, and I think that happens with people across the world of neurodiversity. So I think knowing that asking for those changes is not only okay, but it is the right thing to do from just about every angle. but that unfortunately it's still the case that you may have to push for them and ask for them again, but that it is the right thing to do.
Yeah, of course, of course. Sorry, we are getting a few more questions through the chat. I'm just trying to keep, I think someone was asking, someone, Jane has mentioned, I would really be interested in finding out about new research mentioned around stress and the limbic system regarding ADHD and dyslexia. So Kiran, perhaps we can share that afterwards and send some links that will be useful. We can send, as I say, we should be sending out a link to this recording for anyone that wants to share it with their colleagues, and also the slides from today will be available, and we'll follow that up through with an email. So I think because I'm mindful it's 1 minute to, I just might pass. Thank you everyone for all your contributions on the chat. It's really interesting stuff. And yeah, pass back to my colleague Mary just to wind up the webinar for today for us.
Thank you, Helen. Just getting the details now. Thank you very much to everybody that joined us today. This is me. I'm the Business Development Manager for Platform Wellbeing. If you have any questions, you want any more information with respect to what we've touched on today or what we do within Platform Wellbeing, we offer wellbeing strategies for organisations, we offer training for teams, we offer talking therapies, we can do the talking therapies for organisations or for individuals. Some of the workplace training includes burnout and how to prevent it, compassion and connected leadership, mental health for the organisations, and trauma. Now, the reason I said that is because our next webinar, this is part of a series, is on the 29th of November and tackles burnout. So if you have enjoyed today and you think that you'll get something out of the burnout, definitely think you will, by all means join us. We will have the information sent around to everybody that's attended today anyway. But again, any questions, anything that this has provoked, anything that you think the organisation will need with respect to support for training or counselling, please just drop me a line. And I think that's it, Helen. I need a nod from Helen. Yes, there we are. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for joining us. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.